So welcome to our webinar, Starting a Company in Singapore. It's the introduction webinar, which covers everything you need to understand in the first 30 days of incorporating and running a company here. My name's Anthony Condoris. I'm from a company called FutureBooks. We're an accounting and analytics company. We offer different kinds of services depending on where a business is in its life cycle. So today I'm really focusing on incorporation, company secretary, and in another presentation we talk a little bit more about work passes. So yes, please do visit our website and drop us an email if you'd like us to give you a hand getting a bigger idea off the ground. So let's talk now about some of the various structures and compliance that you'll face incorporating a business in Singapore. As a local director, someone residing in Singapore, you have a couple of options. I think the two that I would consider closely would be a sole proprietorship and a private limited company. The main difference being that sole proprietorship is really not very expensive to maintain. It has a very low cost of compliance, whereas the private limited company is more sophisticated and has a higher cost of compliance. It requires a company secretary, filing of annual financial accounts and various other things you need to do, which pushes up the price. But the other difference to note is that while the private limited business is more expensive, liability is limited to the shareholders, to the value of paid up capital they put into the business. Whereas in the situation with a sole proprietorship, there is unlimited liability, which means that the shareholders individually are liable. Sole proprietorship is still very useful though. It enjoys the separation of an owner and manager, so one party can be the owners of the company, the other one can manage it. And it's effective tax-wise to about $100,000 Sing in revenue, after which point the personal income tax you're paying starts to become quite high, and you're also not getting some of the tax exemptions that you do when you're in a private limited business. So private limited company gives you a little bit more better separation. You have directors and shareholders, and it's far more tax effective at $100,000 plus in revenue. It's also much easier to raise investment in the structure because of the separation of shareholders and directors, which is the reason why a lot of individuals, locals who will start a sole proprietorship business later will convert that to a private limited company. If you're a foreigner though, the sole proprietorship is not really available to you if you're not living here, because you'll discover later that trying to get a work pass in a sole proprietorship is very difficult. So the two structures I think you should take most attention to would be a representative company and the private limited company. Private limited we've just described. Let's take a look now at the representative company. That's useful in situations where, as a foreigner, you're not ready to commit to a full-blown company, but you just wish to do some scouting to find business, develop networks. So it's typical market research. You'd like to get an EP so you can live here for perhaps a year, employ maybe one administration person to help you, but you're not doing any trading. Okay, this is not a sales organization. You're simply using this for the purpose of exploration. Some important government bodies you're also going to need to understand. Let's begin with ACRA, the Accounting and Corporate Regulatory Authority in Singapore. Their purpose is to look after everything that's related to companies, company formation, changes in company structure, anything that's company related. This is the people that we talk to, and you'll find that as long as you meet some basic compliance, incorporating a business with them is very straightforward and it takes a few days. The Inland Revenue Authority of Singapore is responsible for tax collection, personal company tax, indirect taxes like GST, and you really won't have a lot to do with them until you have your annual financial accounts come up, unless of course you decide to register for GST earlier. The Ministry of Manpower, in particular if you're a foreigner, is the government body you need to pay most attention to. And this is the distinction that we make. Just because APRA gives you the right to incorporate a company in Singapore does not necessarily mean that the Ministry of Manpower will grant you the permit to work in that business. Okay, so you can be a director in a company, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can work in it. And the most complicated part for a foreigner for setting up is the work passes from the Ministry of Manpower. Compliance when looking at incorporation, I call it the Big Four. I'm only focusing on 3 of them today: a local director, company secretary, and having a registered mailing address in Singapore. If your business is planning to make more than 5 million in revenue, or you will have a corporate holding as a shareholder in the business, audit will be compulsory. Otherwise, you are exempt from audit. Let's look at some of these compliance issues in a little bit more detail. If we look at, first of all, a local director. This is somebody who's a resident of Singapore, can also be a foreigner, but can be a PR or a citizen. Have to be above the ages of 18 years or above. If you plan to appoint somebody like a friend or a family member to be a director of your company, take note that if they're working for an MNC, they may need to seek permission from that MNC to be a director of another company. Otherwise, a nominee director makes a great substitute, and future books can provide substitute nominee directors for up to 12 months until such time that a foreigner can find a local director they wish to appoint. The registered mailing address is normally the commercial address. This is also where the director intends to work and where the company registers are held. The company registers are the responsibility of the company secretary to maintain. There can be a condominium, so if you decide to work from home, that's fine. But if you are an HDB dweller, you'll have to seek special permission if you wish to classify your place of residence as a work address. When you're appointing a company secretary, in the first year, it may really make no difference. You may decide that in the first year you're just going to appoint anybody to be the company secretary, because really, as long as you have a name down on the APRA Biz file, then you satisfy compliance. However, you may decide later to become a little bit more choosy about who you decide to be your company secretary. And these are some of the things you may wish to consider. Like, for example, does the company secretary who you're appointing have the capacity to maintain the asset registers of the business? The registers are very important, especially when it comes to assets. What's the value of the company? Can they handle complicated issue of shares or transfer of shares? Can they draft the necessary resolutions and transfer deeds and work with lawyers to make that happen? And can they file on time? You know, can they remind and actually carry out their fiduciary responsibility, part of which is to make sure they write to the directors and the shareholders of the company regarding important dates. So, you know, a good company secretary will help you file on time, which means that you avoid late penalty fees. I'm not going to talk too much today about appointing an audit firm, but if you did have to appoint an audit firm, I just want to give you some really basic framework to think about. And it's very simple. Do not choose an audit firm that is the cheapest. Let me repeat it again. Do not choose an audit firm that is the cheapest, because you will discover later that they will cost you more in time and late penalty fees. Cheap audit firms do not want to attend planning sessions with you. They don't want to discuss the setup of the chart of accounts or issues that may be faced during the year the bookkeeper needs to understand. They won't be timely when answering email. And they may put you in a situation where, because they are a volume-driven business, being cheap, they simply never get things filed on time. We've had clients that have told us stories where it's taken them 2 years to try to have their annual financial accounts filed because the audit firm wouldn't complete their annual financial accounts. And so therefore it's very unlikely that they'll actually maintain the very cheap budget that they offered you in the first place. So be very, very careful about accepting cheap quotes. Now, let's talk about what happens and what's involved in actually incorporating a private limited company in Singapore. This is the legal structure I'm just going to focus on for a moment. We can do some very funky things for you. If you would like to set up something that's a little bit more complicated, it's not just a straightforward incorporation, Future Books can do some consulting work with you to best figure out a company holding structure, how loans or investment will move from one business to another, and the best way to structure the revenue and expenses in these businesses. But if you are planning to do something quite simple, you could attempt to do it yourself. And if you are planning to do it yourself, here are some things that you'll need to know in order to get started. You'll need to have a company business name. The business name cannot be the same or similar or a similar name to an existing one, nor can it be a name which is offensive. This is probably the most time-consuming part of the incorporation. It takes a day or two for the name to be accepted and registered by ACRA, at which point you can then do the incorporation. You'll need to have a designated registered mailing address where your mail from ACRA will be sent, and you'll need to think about the nature of the company and then assign an SSIC code that appropriately describes what the business does and what industry it's in. So you have two different kinds of SSIC codes that you can put into the incorporation, so that ACRA understands what the purpose of your business is, and also whether or not there are licensing and other kinds of considerations you may need to take note of. You can then appoint directors using Form 45, and you can appoint at the very least one local director, and then of course you can have many foreign directors if you wish to. With the shareholders, again, you can appoint individuals like you could with a director, but you can also appoint a company to be a corporate holding in the business, and they can be foreigners or locals. You then have to settle on how much paid up capital. You want the minimum requirement is $1, but you may wish to think a little bit more about paid up capital, particularly if you're going for certain government or industry contracts, or if you're trying to build a case to the Ministry of Manpower to hire a local or foreign workforce. Paid up capital is quite an important consideration. You also need to issue shares against that capital. So for instance, if you decide to invest $50,000 in paid up capital, that effectively means you could have 50,000 shares, giving each share a value of $1. The most important thing to remember about share issue is that you give yourself enough increments in the shares such that they can be split against the number of shareholders. So the more shareholders you have in the company, the more increments you need, the more shares you probably need to issue. And of course you need to appoint a company secretary. There are 4 important documents which will arrive as soft copy true originals. First one is the business profile. It's a high level document, only a few pages long. And this document just is a summary, describes what's going on. For example, tells you the registration number or the UEN, the business name, and describes whether the business is exempt from audit. In this particular case, we are exempt from audit, and whether or not the company is live and operational. You could actually put the company into a dormant status if you are expecting to have very few transactions. Here you can see the SSIC codes that have been appropriated to this business. You can see the number of shares which have been issued, 1,000 shares, and paid up capital is 1,000. And you can see also that the shares have been issued as ordinary shares, not preference shares. And down the bottom is the registered office address. The second document that you'll also receive is the Memorandum and Article of Association. It's a far more detailed document which describes the way the business is governed, voting rights of the directors and shareholders, describes what happens if new shareholders come in and there's a share issuance, what that means, can the existing shareholders have the right to put more money in to prevent themselves being diluted. This is all covered in the approximate 100 articles, which are the basics that ACRA offer you when you incorporate. You can, in fact, download this document beforehand and have a lawyer modify this document such that it's congruent with any shareholding agreement that you put together. But normally the shareholding agreement has not already been drafted at the time when the incorporation is done, so that's usually done afterwards. Share certificates. Each of the shareholders in the company are issued a share certificate which describes the name or the name of the business that the shares are being issued to. You can see the certificate numbers here, and you can also see the number of shares which have been issued. The last document is one which the company secretary will put together. And this is the first resolution, quite a long resolution. It will appoint the shareholders, the directors of the business, and also appoints the bank, which will be the corporate bank for the company. Under the Singapore Companies Act, company seal is still mandatory, but I think it's going to be phased out pretty soon. It's something that most of our customers don't use, but there are certain instances where a seal is important. Like, for instance, if you are bringing an institutional investor, it's very likely that that shareholding agreement will require a company seal. However, for daily transactions like employer contracts, applications to the Ministry of Manpower, agreements with suppliers and clients, a company stamp is ample. You can have these made very cheap, and I suggest that the company secretary holds one of these stamps, and another one is also held by the local director of the business. So once you incorporate the company, you then have the right to open up a corporate bank account. In fact, this is one of the reasons why a lot of directors end up incorporating a company in Singapore, is for the express purpose of opening a corporate bank account. And we've done quite a bit of research on which banks in Singapore are most startup friendly. You can go onto our blog via www.futurebooks.com.sg, and you can read the full research that we've done on the banking system. And effectively, we've chosen two that we think are the most startup friendly, being DBS and OCBC, because they had the lowest minimum opening balances. Their minimum average daily balances were quite low as well, but I think very importantly for me was that they made this relatively easy to open the account without foreign directors needing to be physically present in Singapore. And some things you're going to need to get used to is, first of all, it will require 2 directors and or a director company secretary to be present to actually open and close the account. You'll also need to look at 2 kinds of classifications for signatories. You've got authorised signatories and transaction signatories. The authorised signatory is the power to open and close the account, and the transaction signatory are those who have the power to do transactions on a daily basis. The transaction signatories do not necessarily need to be directors. They can be other persons like family members or employees in the business. And I think another thing that's worth noting is that internet banking in Singapore is not that intuitive. I suspect it's because not a lot of internet banking is done. We're still very much a cash economy, which is probably the reason why we have a $10,000 bill, and checks really are still quite important. As I described before, just because ACRA gives you the right to incorporate a company in Singapore doesn't necessarily mean that the Ministry of Manpower is going to grant you a work pass. So this section is particularly important for foreign directors who are trying to seek employment here, or local directors who are trying to employ staff who are foreigners. We're going to hold a completely separate and focused seminar just on work passes, but this just gives you a little bit of an overview and a taste for what to expect. So the first thing that we tried to do for you is to describe the various kinds of avenues that you can take to working in Singapore, and how desirable or undesirable these may be. Most desirable meaning the most robust, the easiest methods, down to the most complicated methods. So at the bottom, we've placed the Entrepass as being the least desirable, because It requires $50,000 paid up capital, and its renewals are not easy because you'll need to meet targets on headcount and revenue. The employment pass is probably for foreigners the most common method at the moment that we are using to help them incorporate and become employees in their business. Next one is the personalized EP. There are some restrictions around ownership in the business and coming in on a personalized EP. We'll talk about that in a moment. Of course, the permanent residency is by far the most easiest as a foreigner, because you're simply informing the Ministry of Manpower where you're working. You're not applying for an application to work there. So let's examine some scenarios now. Let's take everything that we've discussed in the last 20 minutes and try to apply it to some real world examples so you can see the application framework. Let's look at, first of all, a director who's a local who just wants to test an idea. So they decide, okay, we're going to set up a sole proprietorship, very low compliance costs, very straightforward way to get in, very easy. And then I'm simply going to inform the Ministry of Manpower that I'm working in this new company. Note that I'm not applying for an EP or applying for a work pass, simply informing them. And in this legal entity, I'm going to be expected just to pay personal income tax, no company tax. And later, when I'm successful in the idea, gains traction, I'm going to convert to a private limited company to help raise additional funding. Very straightforward, nothing complicated about this. This is something that we do all the time. So the one that's a bit more complicated now, if it was a foreigner who's perhaps on a PEP, they could incorporate a private limited company. They can then inform the Ministry of Manpower, the new company they're working for, and they can employ themselves as a director, but they cannot be an owner or a shareholder in that company. So typically they would make a family member or somebody they trust to become the shareholder in the company. They'll have to pay company rated tax and personal tax on personal drawings, and later they can apply for a PR and then transfer ownership of the business back into their name. Okay, so this is also a pretty straightforward method. Another way to think about this is a foreigner who does not wish to live in Singapore. There may be instances where you simply, Singapore is not really, it's not where your operations are located, it's not where your people are located, it's not where your customers are located, but for tax purposes you just wish to incorporate a company here. Again, you would probably do it as a private limited company, and then you would have to appoint a nominee director. So we could, as Future Books, we could help you with that. And then you could, on your side, we suggest you provide 2 foreign directors to make signing contracts and annual financial accounts a lot easier. When it comes to the shareholding, you have a lot of flexibility. It could be you as a foreigner, it could be a foreign company, it could be a local, doesn't really matter. Of course, you're paying then company rate of tax. The interesting thing is that in this situation, it may be likely that if your operations and your customers are not located in Singapore, that you may in fact not be paying company tax. So success, welcome. This is the close of our introduction on incorporating a company in Singapore, everything that you need to know in the first 30 days to get yourself going. I hope you found it useful. We're publishing lots more webinars. If you'd like to talk to us, it's very straightforward. Just go onto our website. You can type live chat with us, jump on Skype, drop us an email, and we'll come back to you and talk to you. It's www.futurebooks.com.sg. Thanks for listening. I'll see you again soon.